And there we go. Okay.
There we go.
Now we're live. What a Zoom world we're living in. Everybody's like, you're muted. So we're live. I always forget my ADHD and this countdown do not always go together because I'm like 30 more seconds. Let's go. But we have Anna here, one of my favorite people to talk to about admissions. And we've just kind of been chatting all week. We chat all the time. Yeah, we consistently chat.
I mean, it's mostly digital, so it's very exciting. And we can actually chat in real time and look at each other.
And the last time I talked to you was before decision day.
Uh-huh.
And so now we still are deciding in my neck of the woods, but we are close. We are getting there. How have things been for you since the last time we chatted?
Yeah, the decision day is always interesting. The media don't ever seem to acknowledge it, but the Ivies have their decision day, but other schools have decision days at other points in the month or in the calendar. So the sun does not rise and set.
Oh, mate. Well, I like that, and I think that's like I heard from one college, they're like, "Oh, we'll take it up until like the day before classes," and I'm like, "What?" So
yeah.
It depends on the school.
And I'm glad you brought that up. There's someone on Twitter, you know who you are, who raised a really interesting question. And I think he meant it rhetorically. And I think it's a common misconception, which is like, why do we even have these, arbitrary deadlines for when people have to, announce their intentions and put down their deposits or whatever the case may be. And the reality is that on the back, the back of the housework at universities, there's a lot they have to do to get everything ready for that student to show up, right?
Yeah.
And so, there's, I guess, some universe in which, sure, you can just show up at orientation, and then let them know. But as a logistical matter, most schools would try to avoid that. They have to deal with housing. They have to deal with accommodations. They have to deal with registrar stuff.
Yeah.
There's this huge laundry list of things they have to deal with, visas for some students. I mean, financial aid. There's just so much. The list is this long. And so, yes, they need a deadline of some kind, just as a practical matter. If schools are letting you decide right up until orientation, that suggests to me that they have some seats to fill, and that happens. But there's a lot of work that has to get done between when you say, yes, I'm coming, and actually showing up for move-in day.
Yeah, I feel like
housing is another big one. Oh my gosh, I'm glad I never had to do housing. Whew.
Oh yeah, and that was one thing. Is like I just realized my essay. I'm gonna leave my SAT book, but not this big jug. But the one person was like, "You're gonna lose your housing, but it's close enough that it wouldn't really matter, right? Like you're not gonna be guaranteed housing, essentially." But I think that's the thing is I actually talked to a university and we were negotiating financial aid, and they were telling me, because of COVID, we've just gotten so many more financial aid appeal requests. Right. So we're still behind and trying to dig out. And that's something I keep getting stuck, but that's something that seems obvious now that I think about it, that isn't so obvious before, right? So
that makes sense, for people who aren't in those administrative jobs or haven't done those administrative jobs. How would you know? Why would that be, at the top of your mind? It wouldn't. But I was so glad the person asked the question on Twitter rhetorically, because I said, well, I was that person. Well, actually.
I feel like I had that conversation the other day, and I knew where it was going. And this person was like, we're in the ACT uplifted me phase of test optional.
Oh, that was such a big kerfuffle on Twitter.
And it was 3 or 4 tech bros, I think it was. And then, but this one kid said, it uplifted me, and I'm like, how do you know? How? And so they were like, this is the school I went to. I was under the GPA. And I'm like, okay, so I go through the common data set. And I'm like, well, actually, when I look at the common data set, they're accepting 50% of their applicants are between 24 through 29. in the ACT score range. So that doesn't suggest that they care about the ACT. Like, and I went lawyer and did like a review of 10 years of data. I was like, for the last 10 years, it's been 24 through 29 majority. And then in addition to that, what we're seeing is like, it went down on the common data set. And if people don't know what I'm talking about, when you're doing colleges and institutional priorities, like the common data set, and I don't know, do they have that for law school? The common data set?
Not like that. Basically, that information gets routed to the ABA. So same concept, some differences.
Yeah.
Same concept.
Yeah. So it's like people always say, well, if we do test optional, grades are going to become more important, and rigor is going to become more important, and and extracurriculars
already the most important.
I'm like, grades and GPA are already the most important thing. And, I think this weekend at 4 a.m. in the morning when I was like tweeting a bot and then realized I was, somebody who was a bot or looked like a bot, I realized I was like, wait a second, let's think about the hours that you have to put into the SAT and ACT. That's, on 10 to 40, some kids do 50 hours a week over the summer.
It's definitely time spending on other things. And it's time that their teachers could be spending on other things too.
And it's also time that they, over the summer, could be spending in extracurriculars. Because what I think my biggest takeaway from this particular season is that GPA and SATs get you through the door, but stories, service, jobs, and what's that other thing? Extracurriculars close, scholarships. So like, my students with larger GPAs or larger SAT scores are not closing as many scholarships as the kids who are just really interesting to talk to because they just have more to say in those interviews for the scholarships. Is that what you kind of found as well?
Well, yeah, I think, and not just for scholarships. I mean, even for admission, once you're dealing with the selective schools and the more selective schools, right? The way we usually explain it is, the credentials are kind of halfway there, but the credentials aren't enough. That's the beauty of being a highly selective school is you have that luxury to be super picky. They have more kind of good credentials than they could, know what to do with. So, once you have the credentials, the part that you need to get across that finish line is to know how to present your credentials.
Right.
So we think of it as building credentials versus presenting credentials, and presenting credentials would also then include all that other stuff, all the soft factors, the life experience, what it is that you bring to the incoming class potentially aside from the numbers. And there's sort of an art and a science to the presenting part. In a perfect world, it would be more transparent. It wouldn't be as complicated. There's this sort of quixotic idea that law school and undergrad and other kinds of admissions officers for different programs, not all of them, but certainly college, that somehow admissions officers can sort of peer into your soul, with all those soft skills. And I have feelings about that.
Well, I think a good extracurricular, because like a lot of kids will do random extracurriculars because they feel like, colleges like debate or colleges like, hospital work, right? And
I think all admissions officers are pretty agnostic about what it is that you decide you want to spend your time on. You have to do it in a serious way, and you have to commit yourself. You have to distinguish yourself in some way. I think there's certain academic tracks where the activities that you do, need to be part of that larger story. But for, most people applying to just regular old liberal arts programs where you're not committing to a certain pre-professional track, they don't care which activity it is. I've had this conversation. Been giving presentations all around the world to families who are interested in selective U.S. colleges, and so common that there's a parent sitting there with a kind of silent, grumpy teenager sitting next to them, and they're like, "Well, I need you to tell her she needs to keep doing violin." And I'm like, it doesn't have to be violin. She's not
right. It doesn't have to be the oboe, right?
You know?
Like,
Yeah, and I've got little nieces and nephews. I'm sort of starting to have those conversations with them, which is like, what are you excited about? And, how
right.
can you start doing it at a more, more committed level?
And I think that's the thing is like, I like extracurriculars that tell me who you are. Like that's at the end of the day, the more you it is, the easier it is for you to explain it, the more passionate you are. And I find that when you're doing those extracurriculars and you're really actually passionate about it, you just find leadership opportunities. You find opportunities that really distinguish yourself, and those close, aid packages and scholarships. And I think that's, another misconception I had this year. And not necessarily this year in particular, but like in years past, is like, oh, okay, perfect GPA, perfect SAT equals merit aid. And I've been deconstructing that for like maybe 5 years. And then this year it was just like so clear that students believe that GPA and merit aid translate into, GPA and SAT translate into merit aid offer, and then find out that's not always necessarily the case. And it really comes down to like institutional priorities, which is so.
Have I taught you to love that phrase yet?
It's like anything, and it's such a lawyer phrase, like anything and everything.
It's an administrative phrase, right?
Yeah.
You're dealing with large bureaucracies and large institutions. And they do have priorities at the institutional level that are much bigger than any one applicant. And one of the things we tried to debunk, the two of us on Twitter this past week, was this idea that that tests are this all else being equal tiebreaker, and if you've been on the institutional side and you've done admissions in a selective environment, there is no such thing as all else being equal, and you do have institutional priorities, meaning, maybe we have way too many applicants for the nursing program, and we have far fewer applicants for arts and sciences. Trying to compare those applicants as if they were apples to apples, and then saying, well, one person will get in because she has a test score and the other person didn't do a test score. That's not how it works.
And also, like, I've never, I think the thing that people need to realize is the schools that are doing that are very transparent about it. Like, when you go to their websites, when you look at their information, the score is prominent in multiple places. You can see, like, and when you talk to them, even when I have one school in particular that I'm thinking of. When I talked to them, it was very clear that that's what they valued. And so therefore, if you are that school, you usually send enough signals to students to say, hey, for us, it does come down to these factors. And I think a lot of people think that admissions is hiding the ball because we've created this like misinformation, fake news campaign that we can't trust admissions. And the only people we can trust are people that you pay, which is a very convenient narrative. But this all things being equal parent trap phenomenon is just, to me, I'm like, but are you real? Like, even if they're like, oh, but we're in the same district, I'm like, you're not the same person now.
Yeah. One of the things that admissions teams have to be mindful of, or the people who are sort of running the team at the top level of that org chart, is that we all have our own biases and that run in a bunch of different directions. I mean, you might have an admissions officer that just really likes the artsy kids, and with that particular reader, that kind of applicant is just always going to resonate more. And you can sort of replicate that with all kinds of different, I think subconscious. I don't think any of these are conscious. And so you do, at that top level, try to find ways to even that out, right? In theory, a standardized score might help even that out, but ultimately there are just so many factors in play that I find it misleading, and it's usually from the sort of the test prep side, not surprisingly, that there's this sense of like, no, this is the tiebreaker and all else being equal. And I'm like, oh, you've never done admissions, have you?
Right. And also the GPA. It's going to come, if it comes down to anything, it's going to come down to probably GPA classes you took. And I'm like, if it comes down to anything, let's just, like, if we're going to be really elitist and really snobbish, it's going to come down to calc. Like, let's just be honest, right? So, like, sometimes I do find, you know, when I talk to people after, they're like, yeah, it wasn't one thing, like nobody could ever articulate it wasn't this one thing that got this kid out the pile or in the pile. It was just, and I think people don't realize just because you're rejected doesn't mean you weren't qualified. It was just that maybe they were looking for something else or they couldn't find a spot. One of the things I had to like teach the girls this year is like, they'd be like, I'm so hurt because I'm on the wait list. And I'm like, somebody fought to keep you. Like,
yeah. I mean, look, wait lists are unconscionably deep, in my opinion.
Right.
Like an asteroid would have to hit the earth and wipe out your entire deposited class to justify keeping wait lists that are so big. In some cases, the size of the wait list exceeds the size of the incoming class. And I find that, I don't know, it's just
unconscionable.
Certain bad X's, you know. So yeah, being on a wait list is not nothing, but at the same time, you know, odds are not great.
Right.
Wait list, right. You know, that is the reality. And at some point, I do think there's something to be said for just calling it a day, committing to a particular school, committing to showing up there in the fall. Because there are logistics like housing and things like that. I mean, that's one of the tricky things with wait lists is if, you know, you get admitted very, very late in the game, you know, you might not find the housing you want, or you'll just find certain things are more limited. So it gets complicated in the waitlist cycle. I don't think it's a great aspect of college admissions, at least on our fair shores. But you know, it's certainly a phenomenon, and this year I think they're especially deep because schools are having are so limited in doing projections of yield. Putting down a deposit is not an ironclad way to determine yield because some people put down multiple deposits, right? They put down a deposit.
I thought about it this year. I'm not gonna lie. Like I thought about it because I was just like,
well, here's the thing though, and I used to bang this drum much more loudly than I do now. I used to be very anti multiple deposits, but for antitrust reasons, schools are much more limited now in the kinds of things that they can do, as far as telling you, for example, you know, you may not keep your options open. You know, it's complicated, right? Early decision programs are kosher, all that. But you've seen sort of over time, any express language to the effect of, you know, you're not allowed to make multiple deposits has gotten really, really softened. Because they don't want the antitrust officials, you know, breathing down their necks. And this is true across higher ed. So my position now is, unless the school specifically says you cannot put down multiple deposits, you have to withdraw all of their applications, you can't stay on those wait lists, however they want to phrase it. Sometimes that's what scholarships are contingent on. Like, you can take or leave the scholarship, but if you take it, you have to withdraw everywhere else, right? Which is pretty heavy-handed. You know, so there are ways that they still can exercise that kind of power over you as an applicant. But in general, you know, it's a good idea. I think for you, the applicant, it serves you best if you don't put down multiple deposits.
And I think
kind of commit to a place and get on with your life.
And I think the only situation in which I was like, multiple deposits, right? I actually don't like to do deposits when we're negotiating financial aid. I like to get extensions because the minute I do put down the deposit, I've essentially
Power of extensions, yes.
Right. Like the minute I put it out on a deposit, I've lost. As a lawyer, I'm like, I've just lost my biggest bargaining chip, right? The deposit to me.
It depends, right? Because there are multiple levels, right? There are second deposits, whatever. So
Yeah.
you're still free to change your mind, you know, in between a first deposit and a second deposit.
But to be honest, like the appeals just weren't coming in fast enough. And, you know, I don't have a situation with students where we can just decide where we want to go, right? Like I have that with some students, but like there's other students where it's gonna come down to money. And I don't want to, and luckily I was lucky enough for one school to waive the deposit, the other school to say, you can have as much time as you need, and we're going to diligently work on the aid. So I think that's the thing that, you know, I think we always kind of look at it in monolithic terms, right? Like some rich kid putting down like 50 deposits or whatever. And it's like, sometimes it's just a kid needs more time to get the financial aid right, or to determine, you know, I have students whose parents have lost their job and like maybe they're about to get another job, right? And so if they get another job, that extra $2,000 for the dream school, like, and I hate that, but the dream school is going to be something that they want to invest, right? But for other kids, it's just like, I don't know if I can afford this yet. Like, I just don't know. So I think, you know, and I've been talking about this a lot on Twitter. We've seen like this rise of kids need to be financially literate, and we just need to like make sure that they're aware before they're going in. And I'm like, I'm looking at the numbers, and most of you are $10,000, maybe six, maybe seven, $6,000 to $10,000 in terms of your package for tuition. And then after that, we're going all the way up to 15 to 20. I don't know a kid besides maybe three. Like, I mean, I know kids in a different part of the district, right? But most of my kids that live on this side of the district, there's no financial literacy that would explain the number on the page, right? Like if they look down at that page, there is nothing financial in their world that makes that page seem legit. And I think one of the things that I've been talking about a lot on Twitter recently is a need for accountability in the EM world, the enrollment manager world, about why there are so many schools making promises of these big financial aid pots, or these, come on, apply, we have merit aid, we have scholarships. And then on the back end, and I understand like sometimes things change, right? But on the back end, we're not seeing that. And there's not a discussion of that, but there is a discussion of students needing to take on the burden of financial literacy.
It's expecting a lot, and that's really one of the craziest things, in my opinion, about U.S. college admissions. The rest of the world doesn't have this kind of caca financing system, right? For higher ed. And so one of the really weirdnesses of our process is that you have to not only apply, but you have to get in before you find out what you would actually pay. Bottom line, brass tacks. And yes, I know there's some calculators and estimators for a variety of reasons. I don't find them highly reliable, but it's just so bizarre that this factor that is so important to most people, like what's it going to cost? You don't find out until the very end of the process. That is crazy. Right.
And also like people don't understand unless you're working with students. And I find like so many, it's kind of like education. I worked in elementary, right? It's kind of like education in that way, where people have so many opinions about college admissions that do not work in college admissions or do not work with children who are going through college admissions. And I'm like, okay, that's a great opinion, but it's not relevant to the real world. But it's like, I don't think people realize how difficult it can be once a kid gets into a dream school to convince them not to go for financial reasons. And, you know, because a lot of my students, again, are taking out loans. So they're like, well, why wouldn't I take out a bigger loan. And yeah, you can try to explain it to them, but like, they're like, I'm already borrowing against the future. So why wouldn't I just borrow more to go where I want to go?
Right.
And that's something that it's like telling people, okay, well, this is how much you can afford. Most of my kids cannot afford the number on the page. Let's just start there. So they're going to be taking out loans, and it's hard to convince them, after the fact. Like, there's no way for them to have financial literacy when there's not an affordable option on the table for them in their price range, because that's no colleges in their price range, except for.
Well, and you're supposed to be able to read into the future, right? Like, what's your earning capacity going to be?
Right.
What the economy going to be like? What are T-bill interest rates going to be? What? I mean, it's just, who has that crystal ball? And we're expecting.
And kids don't know what $20,000 feels like. They've never done a bill in their life. So it's like, well, sit down with your parents and see how much they make. Well, what if a kid's parents like, I don't got anything?
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing. But I just find that sometimes we're always framing it from middle-class kids whose parents have had a lot of time to save money, and, let's sit down with them. And there's not enough stories about kids whose parents have gone through financial hardships, who've had to pull from the savings, who, or live in this particular area where you could work all day and still be behind on your bills. And when you're behind on your bills, you can't really save money, or you do save money, but then you pull the money. So I think that's what it's kind of like, even with admissions, we do essentially like Harvard down thinking in terms of admissions, right? Like, everything's like, it's so competitive out here. I'm like, it really, like.
Well, look, I mean, that's certainly, I think, driven by the media,
Right.
That's covered. And honestly, cannot remember where I read it. There was a study done that showed where journalists, at the fanciest national publications, where they went to school. And it's a very small number of schools. They basically cover their own schools. There's just there's not much diversity of any kind, in those newsrooms. They say they're working on it, but in terms of where they went to school, there's a reason that they think the Ivies are the end all be all, which is silly. It's just such a it affects such a small number of people, right? And it's just not relevant to most people.
And that's what I find even when I'm pitching, right? Like, if I'm pitching a student, the student that is applying to highly rejective is the one that's usually going to be picked for the story. Like, no matter what, like how interesting this other kid is, if they're only applying to, and there are some great publications. Like, we have the Washington Post here that really does really phenomenal work about our flagships. And then we're lucky because our local paper has to also be like a nationally respected paper. Right. But, I think we have to kind of also think about the narratives that we're putting out and be more conscious about, like, who am I actually talking about, right? Like, because when we're talking about financial literacy, we're talking about kids with savings, right? Or kids who have parents who have savings, right? I am horrible at financial aid. That's something I feel like I'm going to try to work on over the summer or hire out. But I'm horrible at financial aid. So sometimes I'm just sitting with a kid and we're just Googling together, finding.
But look, that changes constantly too, and that is just like admissions. Financial aid is also governed by institutional priorities that are never going to be in front of the curtain, right? They're never going to be terribly transparent about how that sausage gets made. So I admire the instinct to go become an expert, but it's constantly evolving, and
and that's not what I want the children of this generation to be an expert on.
No, and it's a broken system. I mean, it's deeply broken.
And I also think it's like there's also an assumption when we write these articles that every child, they're like, this is what you need to be doing for your kids. My kids are very independent. Like I remember one of them was like, wait, your mom helped you do your field trip forms? And I was like, yeah. And she's like, I have never had a parent do like, I filled it all out and just been like, sign here. I've gotten the checkbook, I've written the check, sign here. Like, so a lot of, especially first gen, or even, I find in immigrant families, their children are so fiercely independent, which is
very self-sufficient.
Yeah. And which is such a blessing, right? Because like they'll come to you with a timetable. This is what I'm doing. I've researched it.
Important life skills, right?
Right. But we always write colleges, letters. And I'm thinking now, like, I should have one of them actually write, if you're a kid, this is how I did it. But we always have college letters. By the way, Stephanie's not here because she's doing an AP exam. So shout out to Stephanie.
Stephanie.
And she's one of the most independent kids. But, we also have to have space in the narrative for if you're applying on your own, if you're like, this is how you do a CSS profile on your own. And, I have kids that are like, I don't even know where to, like, I just remember one was like, what is this? Like, what's the income after taxes? And I'm like, it's on the W-2 form. And then I realized this kid has no conception of what a W-2 form.
Yeah, actually, that's one of my dreams for inline. After, moved on, or, grown past the college applications themselves, is to kind of do the same thing, but for the financial aid forms, which
thank you
should be more of a national scandal than they are.
It's like, why can't we just import this? Why can TurboTax do this, import, but we can't do this for anyway? But speaking of inline and essays, you and I were also discussing this New York Times article that came out about selling pain.
Selling your pain. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what was your first impression of that article?
It's a deeply moving personal story. So, but sort of on the macro level, in terms of the issues, the bigger landscape, I think it's very problematic that there are these extra hoops for people to jump through if they have had a difficult background or experienced trauma in some way. And those are usually in the optional universe, right? Mm-hmm. You have the option of writing these extra essays. But as with and we've had this conversation too, mm-hmm. on Twitter, anything optional is going to create a sense of pressure in the student.
Right? I'm coming back to that. Yeah.
I could be doing, and if I don't do it, what if that's the one thing, that makes the difference, that sort of tips me over? And to your earlier point, with admissions, sometimes it's an accumulation of little pluses, and it's not any one big plus, that tips you over, and every little plus helps. And so I think creating extra layers of work for kids to do who have had difficult backgrounds, I think it's well-intentioned on the part of the colleges, but oh my gosh, let's think about what this is actually doing and what that's signaling, right? Mm-hmm. And for some people, and I'm not an expert in trauma, there are people who are, and they study this and they have clinical mm-hmm. practice and all that. But from what I understand, with trauma, there's a cost to.
There is always a cost.
I was thinking about that because, of course, college admission is always on my mind. I was thinking about that when I was watching the Woody Allen, Mia Farrow, Dylan story on HBO, mm-hmm. and the effect that trauma had on her to begin with, the daughter, mm-hmm. but then the additional sort of the amplification of it from having to kind of revisit the story and repeat it so many times mm-hmm. With the supposed experts. That's its own extra layer of trauma, right?
Yeah.
And my mind immediately went to, what are we doing to these kids, and sometimes young, adults, they're not all kids,
right?
They're returning students, or whoever they are, inviting them, and from their perspective, at least, feeling encouraged to relive mm-hmm. stuff that is very hard for them. I don't know. I don't think that's a
There's a
great
better
outcome.
way. There's just a better way, right? Because, you know, like I'm currently in dispute with Virginia Tech, and like their discrimination question is like, what's the time that you've experienced discrimination? You
Yep.
know, or
There are a lot of those.
witnessed it, and
Those are
then like,
frustrating.
and they're like, and what did you do, and how did you do it, and da da da. And when I looked at the rubric, it was like, if the person's emotionally impacted to the point where the academic and the social life suffers, you actually get a point down, not a point up. And then it's like, if it's small but they perceive it to be big, like, so it's like, but the one thing I said to them is like, but okay, so now I've poured my heart out to you, and then maybe I get in and I get 0 merit aid award. What does that tell me? Like that you did not,
or you get rejected after you've poured your heart out,
or I get waitlisted,
and
right?
they tell you not to take it personally after they made it really, really personal.
Right. And then
right?
also there's no person to talk to that kid on the back end to say like, how do you feel after you wrote that? How did you experience that? And then, but on top of that, what I find is like, how much racism is enough racism for that question. So I will come back to a kid, and when I used to work on the other side of the county in the richer parts, or even in Fairfax, which is incredibly rich, behind gates and things like that, I would go one day, they would have no experience. Oh, I don't know. The next day I would come back, and it's like all of a sudden there's just a perfect story. And I'm like, well, where did you get? Oh no, something I remembered. And when I just remember one time I was working with another kid pro bono, and she was telling me a story, and I was like, wait a second. I said, do you know this particular kid? And I realized, like the Little Fires Everywhere, that the story had been stolen and then amplified. Or like one of my Black students was like, well, this is not going to work because I wasn't called the N-word, so maybe I should just drop that in, that I was called. It becomes this snowball, like what is good enough in terms of discrimination, and what is good enough in terms of whatever. And I think for me, I always say for those type of questions, it would be so much better if you asked a kid, how has your identity shaped you, and how do you want it to shape your experience in college? Like that to me allows anybody, because one of my kids was like, I'm going to be honest, and I don't care if I don't get into Virginia Tech. I have not experienced discrimination because I am a white male who is around white men all the time. And if that is not good enough, that's fine with me. If they don't perceive it, and they're like, when I talked to the Virginia Tech, they were like, well, there's different types. And like that he should have been able to realize. I'm like, but that's his reality.
That's his reality. And you know, the way, and so these internally on our content team for Inline, we call those the ISM questions, which just started growing like mushrooms, right? Among colleges.
And I think that kid evolved eventually to realize like there are some things that I wasn't seeing.
Well, so one of the, we've had long conversations about this internally. Right. We're actually tweaking and updating and completely revisiting the advice that we're giving around some of those questions as they've become more popular. And there's one in particular we spent a lot of time talking about, which is go check out the Babson essays. Oh goodness. Right. One of the things that we are changing in our advice is you might even have a really interesting story to tell for this kind of essay, but you might not, might not benefit you to tell it. For example, if you're really, really honest and talk about the effect of that experience or that trauma on you, if you're giving out signals that you're going to have a tough time for whatever reason with your coping skills or being in the right headspace, to perform really well in college, that doesn't benefit you,
And that's the truth, right?
What you're signaling. And wow, again, like we're asking so much of young people to know exactly how to walk that line. Anyway, so we're spending a lot of time figuring out like what's the right advice to give for those kinds of essay prompts where even if you meet some
Mhm.
stated threshold of, yes, this is an experience that, we're inviting you to talk about here, like, how much racism is enough or whatever, right?
Or how
Even if
much struggle is enough, or
threshold
like
isn't
is an
actually
obstacle big enough,
right. And
right?
then is it, part two of the analysis is it a good idea for you to write this essay, or how should you write this essay, and how honest, does it benefit you to be? It's
And how
crazy.
traumatic is it going to be for you, right? And I
Well, yeah,
think
on top of that.
the thing is, like, even obstacles are kids hearing, oh, no, not sports, or no, it should be about sports, or like there's so much conflicting advice, right? And I think it's like the process has become so convoluted, and so it's like we want to know you, but on our terms. And it's like, that's not knowing me. Like,
I'm
it's
actually
like,
working
imagine on
on
a date, somebody's like,
yeah,
okay,
yeah,
I want to get
yeah.
to know you. And you're like, oh, well, and they're like, ooh, what was your biggest obstacle that you've overcome? And you're like, wait a second, I don't want to talk. And I think that's the thing. What I find is a lot of the admissions essays are really centered around things that are a deficit, when there could be strength-based questions, right? And how, like, I remember I was talking to somebody about, like, I'm having like a writing thing over the summer with Black girls, and they're like, oh, so you're gonna like write about like George Floyd and blah blah. I was like, no, about their favorite item in their closet. Like, because I think there's this conception of who a kid is. And I remember one kid was like, I'm just so bland. And I'm like, but everybody needs mayo at times. Like, there's space for you to be bland. Don't I think the biggest thing is, I always tell kids, I want to be able to put your essay down and throw it into a pile and have one of your friends walk by and be able to identify that that's you. That's all I'm looking for. I'm not looking for the best essay or whatever. I just want it to feel very you. And if the essay feels you, then it's easier for them to feel like you're in the room with them when they're making the decision. And I heard one person say, I always think about, like, which kid do I can't shake. Like, I just can't shake this. Like, even if I put them in the no pile, I'm like, I go to bed at night and I'm like, oh, I need to pull them out. That's what I want. I want it to be like the last thing somebody sees, or I just want it to look like you. And if that means that you don't get in on you, then that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I laugh at some of these essay prompts because I think they're clearly written by a whole bunch of middle-aged people who have the concerns of middle-aged people. And so
Right.
basically they're basically creating these topics, inviting essays on what I would think of as sort of a conventional midlife crisis question. It's so bizarre to expect teenagers to have these sort of midlife ruminations.
How long until the cancel culture woke question? Is there already a cancel culture woke question?
Well, the Common App doesn't get released for the coming season until later in the year. So, we know what the Common App questions are, and they did swap out one of them. But as far as the school supplements, we don't have those yet. But, to your earlier point, and I'm actually working on a presentation on this topic right now, so it's very much on my mind, which is like, what are schools signaling with the questions that they're asking that they're probably not intending? And that's just that's a tough part of being an admissions officer, is the communication aspect of it. And they might not, we're all in our own little bubbles, right? So, like, what are the parts where they're signaling something that they might not be aware of? For example, on the Harvard supplement, and it's like above the fold on the screen, it's like one of the first questions you see is, question about, whether you plan on doing sports in college, and if so, what sport? And the signaling power of that is I think unintended, which is, this matters. It signals. I don't think that's the actual intention, but like, this is really important. You should have a sport. It really matters to us because we put the question way up here, right? And I happen to know a sports coach. I won't say which sport, who works at Harvard, who's done it for many, many years. I went to high school with him back in the day. And it turns out that, no, that's not what the admissions office is trying to signal with that question. It's just that, unlike I don't know, say Florida State, they don't have a whole apparatus internally for recruiting at the level of a Big Ten school. And so it's basically asking you to self-identify so that basically you get connected with the right coaches and then they can take it from there, right?
Yeah.
But it's actually not meant to signal, oh, we give some kind of preference to sports in general. But then it gets complicated too, because then all this data came out from the affirmative action lawsuit, and you see the preferences that you get as a recruited athlete, right? But what if you're not recruitable as an athlete? Is that what does that question mean if you're just someone who has hobbies and maybe it's a sport or maybe it's not a sport? So it gets really muddled, just having that question there and giving it this priority in the order of questions. It kind of assumes that you know how sports recruiting works internally at Harvard. Why would you know that, right? How would you know? So that's just one example, not to knock on Harvard. I mean, I could find something just about every
There's enough reasons
that I have a bone pick with.
And I think that's the thing is I think one of the things that really I feel like I kind of evolved in this year is realizing sometimes it's not people, it's institutions, right? Because I've met some really great people that work for the elites and the Ivies and the highly rejectives, right? But they're not they're like, I'm not gonna be able to, that's a three-year move to that direction, right? So
these are big lumbering nonprofit bureaucracies. I worked at University of Chicago. I worked at Stanford. It is not my temperament to thrive in big lumbering nonprofit bureaucracy. And so, but they are what they are, and yes, this is true for all bureaucracies, right? And so, and these forms and these platforms and these questions, they're not built by the Amazon Prime team, right? And changing anything is probably done by committee and blah, 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 blah. Nothing happens quickly. I mean, I remember at a meeting, I won't say which school, they're both wonderful. But I remember when I first showed up for my job, and I was told, well, we need to pick out a phone for you. It was a landline, still use landlines. And they wanted a meeting to talk about which model phone I should get, and should they pay the extra, whatever, it was something stupid and extortionate. Should they pay the extra $60 so that I'd have the little light that would blink red if there was a voicemail waiting for me? And they had a meeting with multiple people to discuss this. And I'm like, because you assign a value of 0 to your own time and all these people's time, only if you assign that value to everyone's time does it make sense to have a meeting. Otherwise, just pay for the blinking light. Right? That's not how bureaucracies work. That's not how large, lumbering nonprofit institutions work. They don't have a meeting with 4 people to discuss the blinking light.
Right. And it's I think that's something that people don't understand, right? Is if you think there are people who want certain policies in place, but they either are just at the institution that is not going to do them, or the board of visitors is not going to approve that, or they're okay, well, I some person was yeah, I was ready to go, and then they were let's go to committee, and it's oh.
Well, and you can tell when they do try to rush something through. So some of these really sort of badly done ism questions that we're talking about before reminded me so much of when they tried to quickly roll out new drop downs for gender identity a couple years ago, when that was kind of a newer thing. And some of the schools did it so badly because they kind of rushed through it and they're not used to that. Quickly. I mean, some of those drop downs when they were new, I remember there was one school in particular that conflated gender identity with sexual orientation. So it was all in the same drop down. Are you trans? Are you gay? Pick. It was just a mess.
I think that's the thing.
There are downsides to them trying to push something through quickly. God knows.
I think that's the thing. And it's it's never as simple as you think. And it's also not as complex as you're making it out to be, right?
That's
So it's like, and
things
so
in life. Yeah.
when I talk to people, I'm like, honestly, like they're like, what would get more Black students to the door? I'm like, food. If you have multiple dinners with them, some of them will close with you. Food,
Yeah.
like food. It doesn't have to be as complicated as you're making it out to be. Food and marinade. Like if you give somebody a huge marinade package, you're going to be at least considered till the very end. Like even if they're not like in love with you, at least considered. At least considered. And like just like you all like, oh well, I would love to be able to tell you that we got you all the way down to, 3 days before admissions. I would love for you all to know that some of these kids were going to consider you, but you didn't spend that time building the relationship long enough. So they didn't know you. And especially I believe with Black populations, I can't speak for other populations, but with all the inherent distrust in admissions, you really have to, or in the world, you like, they're not going to go for an unknown quantity. Like you have to at least be known. And it's like, okay, yeah, I understand like the reservations, but I know this person. They said that they're going to take care of me. I trust that it has to be something really personal for that build. But yeah,
I think right. I see that too with the veteran population that I work with on my nonprofit life. You can develop that pipeline, but ultimately the school, and I've had that role. I'm not casting any aspersions here. It's hard to get the communications right and to build those relationships. It's a big part of the job. I think at some schools, it's perhaps not taken seriously enough in terms of whom they're putting into those roles. I mean, these are public-facing ambassadors for your program, and there's just certain populations and certain demographics where you do have to go that extra mile, and there's no pipeline community-based organization in the world that can fix that for you, if they've got a great pipeline for you, but you're not really building that relationship and making them want to pick you instead of someplace else that they got in.
Right? And I also think what we see a lot in admissions, and actually like I had come out against this like Making Care Common report, which is like from Harvard, where it's like you all put everybody together, like, and that's never going to work, right? It's like diverse students. And you haven't defined what that means. I don't know who that is. And then you're talking about like, well, they need to be close to home. And I'm like, who needs to be close to home? Which population? Like, so like, I always think of it like the same way I define the problematic issue with pronouns on the SAT, but I'm like, them and their, or like themselves or oneself or him. It's always like this group, right? And if I can't identify the person in the group, then we're using a pronoun that technically, even though I don't subscribe to this, technically is like them or their, whatever. And I think people don't realize you have to niche it down, and you need to bring your existing students into the room and be like, what did we suck at when we were recruiting you? That is like that. And I promise you, there are certain populations that are going to be really honest, and there are certain populations, but if you talk to enough kids, they will tell you what you failed to do to recruit them and give you guidance on what to do next every single time.
I agree 100%. I know we're coming up on time. And so I know that you're so good at, you've built this amazing platform and you're so good at.
And I told you to build one too.
Channels. I'm taking baby steps. I bow down to the Jedi Master here. And
by the way, I have not seen Star Wars.
You know what? I should stop using Star Wars references because I'm actually
no. I know it, but I'm like, I just wanted to let you know.
But I will say this, for whoever's watching live or will be watching a recording later, if you have questions that you'd like us to tackle, more, I'd love to find out what those topics are, because I always have so much fun talking to you. And, we talk about whatever the two of us find interesting.
Yeah.
And hopefully that's interesting to other
Maybe
people.
you're going to have a TikTok soon, because TikTok people can submit questions. Did you know that?
That is true. That is true. But for whoever's, not watching in real time right now, please come find us on Twitter or wherever you're watching this, and let's see what people are finding interesting for our next conversation.
I mean,
I'll have you back, which I hope you do.
I will have you. I always am like, you want to talk? So, but yeah, I think that's the thing. So, I'm thinking about dipping. I'm scared of TikTok. So I'm scared of any platform where I can't control the comments, right? But I'm thinking about going on TikTok and being like, tell me your admissions questions. I'll get them answered. Because I think that's the thing is like, one of the things people are like, well, just ask more questions. I'm like, certain kids just don't feel comfortable. But I feel comfortable asking anybody any question at any time and then telling them you're wrong, this is stupid, and this is what you need to do. That's a very Aquariusness of me. But yes, of course, I'm going to have you back. And I think I might have to go on TikTok and be like, what are your questions about admissions? Please don't be mean to me. I'm a millennial. We're very sensitive. So yeah, I would love to hear people's questions, students' questions, and I'm going to talk to you afterwards about an idea that I have. But
okay,
yes,
fantastic.
I'm going to close out the live. And where can people find you? I know your Twitter's on the screen.
Twitter is good. If you want to send me a DM, come find me on LinkedIn. Those are probably the two best places to come find me. Or come to inlinecoach.com. There's a contact form. I actually do read them. So
do you? I send them to my father. I didn't read them. But TikTok.
I read all those. I read the support tickets, all of it. I won't be able to do that forever, but
are you going to be on TikTok soon?
I think it's inevitable.
Do you feel like I'm going to be on TikTok soon? Yeah.
I think by the time we get there, they will have moved on to something.
It's like, this is me doing a TikTok dance, and the kids are always like, "Stop doing that."
I just don't know that I can be as entertaining as. I mean, what's so wonderful about TikTok is just the explosion of creativity. I love it so much, but I'm like, ooh, I don't know if I can compete for attention with these amazing.
But I also wonder,
people.
Can't y'all just dance? Like now we're in a choreographed dance, like all the time. Like, isn't that? But they tell me that they don't actually do them like when they go out. So I'm like, oh, I got it. So, but like the commitment there is incredible.
I don't know. Maybe we'll carve out a little niche there.
Yeah, I will. I'm going to close this out. But yes, bye everyone, and reach out to us. My Twitter is at the top. I'm Jen the Tutor, except for on Facebook, I'm Real Jen the Tutor because another Jen the Tutor took it. But yep. All right, bye, guys.